Hi all. Today we're going to be exploring the Sitecore demo portal, some of the fun stuff that you can do with it. For today's video, we're going to be taking a look at more of an vanilla out-of-the-box installation of Sitecore, and we're going to be seeing some fun stuff that you can do with it. So what we've done on the portal so far is we've created a new Sitecore instance. We've actually created it of demo type Experience Edge. We're calling it product XM plus Edge. But really what that is, it's a vanilla instance of Sitecore installed. It has Headless Services installed. It has SXA installed. And it also has the Experience Edge connector installed. For this demo, like I say, we're going to be using this instance of Sitecore on the demo portal. But in theory, you could do the same process that we're about to do with any instance of Sitecore that has a publicly available URL and has Headless Services installed and SXA installed. If you want to do the Experience Edge stuff, you could also have the Experience Edge connector installed, but it's not mandatory for most of the scenario that we're going to run through today. All right, so we're going to run through some instructions on setting up a JSS app. The goal for today is to run through with the JSS CLI, create an app, and get that app deployed into a running instance of Sitecore that we have here in the portal. The main difference that we're going to focus on is if you were to deploy a JSS app to an instance of Sitecore, you would deploy the items. For example, we're going to use the JSS style guide. You would deploy the items for the JSS style guide, and you would also deploy the files for the JSS style guide, files that define the Sitecore website, the Sitecore web node. You would also define the JSS application. What we're going to do a little bit differently today is instead of deploying files, which is not allowed, you're not allowed to deploy files to a remote instance, which is what we have today. We're going to be using Sitecore SXA headless tenants and headless sites to do the management for us for creating the website, creating the JSS app more on the fly instead of using the file-based, config-based approach. Let's get started. We're going to take a look at the terminal. We're going to just make sure that we have JSS installed, and we're going to create a JSS app. So to start, let's just make sure we have the JSS CLI installed and up and running. Let's take a look and see what version we're on. We're on version 20, the latest version of CLI. We also have Headless Services 20 and Experience Edge 20 installed on our instance of Sitecore, so we are compatible in this setup. Okay, now that we have that set up, let's go ahead and create a JSS app. Now, if you're familiar with the JSS app creation process, we're probably used to JSS create. New for version 20 in the CLI, there is a new command in a new process, npx create Sitecore JSS. It's actually quite nice. It kicks off sort of a configuration wizard through the CLI, which is great. So let's go ahead and do that. npx create Sitecore JSS. It's going to take a moment and kick off our configuration wizard. All right, first of all, which template would you like to create? We're going to be using Next.js today. We're going to go ahead with this. Where would you like your new app created? We can have it auto-create a folder. Next.js is the name of the app. That's fine with me. What is the name of your app? Sitecore JSS app. Sure, that's fine with me. Again, I'll just use the default. What is your Sitecore host name? Okay, well, this is our instance of Sitecore that we have already configured and deployed. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. Here we are in the demo portal. I'm going to go ahead and copy the administrator password and log in. And here we go. For now, we're just going to grab this, the host name of our Sitecore CM. Looks good. We're going to drop that right here. I'm going to let's do no schema for this one. I think that's the best thing to do. Perfect. How would you like to fetch layout dictionary data? We're going to use GraphQL. We're going to be looking at exploring the Experience Edge connector at the end of this video, and we need GraphQL for that. We're going to use static site generation for this. and it asks, would you like to include any add-ons? I'm going to deploy the JSS style guide, the next JSS style guide for this. You can just hit the space bar and it'll select it for you. Additional languages, you don't need to do this. I think the style guide has an example link to Danish, so sure, yeah, we'll have the Danish language. We'll add that in. All right, that took roughly 1 minute to complete. We've now created our JSS app, and I can navigate to it here on the command line. I called it Next.js. Looks good. All right, we are now in the root of our app that we created. What next? Well, traditionally you would do JSS setup that would create the configuration files that can then be deployed into Sitecore to hook up the website and app. You don't necessarily need to do that. Again, we're going to be using Sitecore Headless Tenant and Sites for that instead, but it's still a good exercise to go through. It can kind of auto-generate some of the stuff for you. So let's actually go ahead and do it, even though we're not going to be using the config files. In this case, it asks, is your Sitecore instance on this machine or accessible? No, it's not. It's a remote instance. That's why we're not able to deploy files to it at all. It's a remote instance. Sitecore hostname. What was that? I just copied it up above. Let's go grab it again. Here it is. It's our instance running right here. It's going to auto create this JSS import URL. Yep, that looks good to me. Sitecore API key. We have not yet created a Sitecore API key, so let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go to System, Settings, Services, and we're going to go ahead and just create an API key, mostly just leaving the defaults as is. We'll put some wildcards in for cores and allowed controllers and save that. We're going to copy the GUID for the API key and we'll go back and use that. There it is with the braces. Let's have it auto-generated deployment secret, which we will use, and looks good. We're all set. Next, we can go ahead and do some steps. Like, for example, you might want to, I don't know, update maybe the JSS style guide, play around with it a bit. But realistically, what we want to do is we want to deploy this to Sitecore. We want to get the JSS style guide deployed into the Sitecore installation that we have up and running. And what we're going to do for that is we're going to deploy the items using the JSS deploy items command. Now, we're not quite ready for that. We do need to add some configuration in Sitecore in order to do that. Now, if you were to deploy the items and files together, that's something you could sort of go ahead and do that, and it's a little bit easier. But what we're going to do is we're going to navigate into Sitecore. We're going to create a headless tenant, a headless site, a headless app, all in the Sitecore content tree, and that will be sort of in lieu of the config files that you might deploy. So let's go ahead and do that next. All right. If we take a look at this instance, it is completely blank. There is no content, no sites, no anything like that. But we do have Headless Services and S6A installed, which gives us the opportunity to install and add a headless tenant. So let's go ahead and do that. You can leave the name as is for this one. A tenant is created. And you can go ahead and create a headless site below that. It'll create the headless site and the headless app. To make things simple, let's name the site the same name as the JSS app that we just created. So if we go and take a look at the app, I'm actually going to open, let's go ahead and open it right here. We just created an app. It is under Next.js. Let's go ahead and open that folder. Just to take a quick look around, we did our JSS setup, and you can see that through this file here. The next thing we're going to look at is under the Sitecore config. It has now set up this config file that would, in theory, be deployed to the Sitecore instance to define the site and the app. So we can see here's the site. Looks good. And here is the app. It is named Sitecore JSS app. And to keep things as easy as possible, we're going to steal that app name and use that in our creation of this site and app. I'm going to leave the other settings blank. If I go to site settings, you'll see I have a GraphQL endpoint and deployment secret. I do want to set those. I don't necessarily need to set them right now, but I'll go steal them. I have them handy. So for example, in the JSS config file, it has auto-generated this deployment secret for us. So let's grab that. We can go ahead and use that. That's our deployment secret. In terms of GraphQL endpoint, we can again go back to our app file. You can see that it does use a default Sitecore API graph edge URL for the endpoint, which is sort of the mock endpoint on the CM for Experience Edge. So let's go ahead and grab that. This would go in the GraphQL endpoint. In theory, that would work. I believe that there is an issue that doesn't get applied properly. We'll create the site and then we'll reapply the GraphQL endpoint to make sure it's all set up. So let's create this. Nice, very quick. We have our headless site. And if you're familiar with SXA, this is quite familiar. You have your presentations, your setting, your data folders, and right now we have a single homepage. Nothing's really set up. It's a blank homepage, but we do have the structure of our headless site. We have the site node. It's created right here. And we also have the GSS app created, and all the settings for the app are housed under the settings item. So we have the app name. We have the GraphQL endpoint. That actually did not apply correctly. Unfortunately, I thought it should be /Sitecore/API graph edge. So we can reapply that there. So let's go down and take a look at a few of the other GSS app settings. We're going to have to make a few changes before we deploy our items from the CLI to this instance of Sitecore. We take a look at the import user. Sitecore GSS import is the standard user. If you're going to be injecting items like we're going to be injecting it under our new headless tenant and site. Out of the box, this user does not have permissions to create items in this location. You could navigate to the GSS import user. You could update the settings, or you can just use an administrator or something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and use one of our users called super user is an administrator, and we'll have all of the rights to create the items as needed. I do leave a lot of the other settings as is for the import process. You can do whatever you want. If we navigate down to the bottom, we have a few other settings that are of high importance. In terms of server-side rendering engine, it actually is important to set this right away. There can be some login problems if you don't set this correctly. Node.js, it's okay if you're in development, you have Sitecore and your headless app running in the same place, but we're going to have the headless app running remotely away from the Sitecore installation. So we're going to switch to HTTP. We also have the deployment secret that we added when we created the site. We have these two settings here that we're going to leave them blank for now. They are important, specifically when you want to get Experience Editor or Horizon working with a deployed front-end application. We're going to come back and take a look at these settings later. But aside from that, we're in good shape. We have the site and the app set up and ready to go. And in theory, we'll now be able to deploy items directly into our installation of Sitecore. Deploy items -c-d. You can look up the parameters if you want to deploy them. All right, let's see what happens here. We're pushing our items from the GSS, the Next.js style guide into our Sitecore installation. All right. It took a few moments, but that looks like a success. Let's go take a look at our Sitecore installation. Let's refresh our site that we've created. There's some new stuff. There have been some folders added. I guess that's part of the Next.js style guide. And here under the home item, it's been updated to have a home, a couple child pages, and lots of content below that. So very simple, Next.js style guide, but a really good example of getting started and pushing something into Sitecore. All right. A few other things. If we were to, what we've done is nothing too crazy. Like traditionally, let's say you're using a standard headless approach where you'd use the config files. In this scenario, we would have done something like try and push the config files and push the items. Everything would have been hooked up. What we did differently is we used headless tenants, headless sites that were able to create more on the fly and deploy the items into that instead of a traditional GSS site. And again, in this case, we can't even deploy the configs because this is a remote instance of Sitecore. We're still able to deploy items and do everything that we need, which is awesome. Okay, what should we do next? We now have the items deployed into Sitecore, and in theory, we're ready to start our application. We could run it locally in JSS start connected mode, and we'll be able to run the app while pulling content and layout and all of those details from Sitecore. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to run GSS start connected. That'll take a moment, and if everything goes well, we'll be in pretty good shape to open this on localhost 3000 or something like that locally. All right, it looks good. We're very close now. If we were to go to localhost 3000, we're very close. I believe we're going to run into an error, but we can take care of that in just a moment. We did hit an error. All right, so let's take a look at that. Look at that, very handy. I have a knowledge base post that explains exactly what's going on in this situation. What's happening is we're attempting to run a standard GSS application under a headless tenant, headless site. There's a few steps to take in order to get that to run properly. It's documented here. We're going to use this approach of adding a root item ID and 2 files to get everything hooked up and running properly. All right, let's go ahead and do that. Let's go to our source files for our front application. If we go to the lib folder, we'll see that there is a dictionary service, and it actually mentions it right here. If you run into this problem, you should define a root item ID. I'm going to go ahead and do that. We're going to grab a GUID from Sitecore and drop it in. It's not very clear on which GUID to select, but an example of what you can do is you can go to your home item, in this case, and grab the template GUID, and you can grab that as a working example of something you can add to this GUID here. We now have the root item ID defined in the dictionary service factory. Let's also do under GraphQL sitemap service. We'll have the same exact root item ID there. Perfect. So we've now updated those 2 files. We can go back to localhost 3000, refresh, and we should be hooked up. We do. We have the style guide up and running. Nothing too fancy, but the cool thing is we now have it running locally. We have all of the content being served from our Sitecore installation. So just as an example, you can navigate down. I think the home page is under this content block. We can do something like that. We're running on local. All right. You could save that. By default, this application is running against the master database. So you just do a refresh and it's on localhost. Great. That's just, to prove that we're grabbing content directly from Sitecore and we're all hooked up and ready to go. Okay, so we're in good shape. So far, we have configured our site and our app in Sitecore. We've deployed the items into Sitecore. We have the style guide running locally, and we're all connected. So what should we do next? Well, let's have some fun with Vercel next. Instead of running this locally, let's take this a step further, and we'll deploy this style guide app to Vercel, and we'll have Sitecore running. In our case, we have it running on the demo portal, the Sitecore demo portal, and we'll hook it up to a Vercel deployment. So what we're going to do next is we're going to go back to our terminal where we were running the GSS app in paired connected mode. Let's cancel out of that, and we'll get started with Vercel. So you can go ahead and install the Vercel CLI. It's super easy to get started. You can just run a command and have it. I have installed already, and what you can do is you can just type in Vercel. It's super smart. It'll be able to detect where it is, and it will determine in this case that we don't have a project set up and hooked up. So let's go ahead and start that. Would you like to set up and deploy? I would. We're in the Next.js folder, so yep, that looks good. Which scope do you want to deploy? I have a hobby account under my own name as well as an enterprise account. Let's deploy this to my hobby account, Scott Mulligan. Link to existing project. No, thank you. We're going to have it create a project for us in Vercel. What's your project's name? I'll use the default. Next.js is fine. Which directory? The style guide is in the root, so we're okay to use that setting right there. And we'll keep going. All right, it has auto-detected that this is a next JS app, it has some default settings, and we are fine to use the default settings. So I can say, no, I don't want to modify these, and we can continue with the deploy. All right. Now that's kicked off. It's creating a project, and it will kick off a build and deployment to the new project. So let's actually bring up Vercel, and we'll take a look and see what's happening. Okay, let's find the right spot. We're going to go to our hobby account, and here is our Next.js app. It is created, and it has kicked off a deployment, which is awesome. We'll let that run for another moment, about another minute, and we'll see the result. All right, our deployment is complete. You can go ahead and click on it, and we've now deployed the front end for the style guide to Vercel. You can see here it is, it's pulling content from our Sitecore installation. Still says localhost, but we'll update that in a little bit. So we're in good shape. We have, in theory, everything working, Sitecore, Vercel, but we're missing one piece, and that's really, it's hooking up some additional parameters, some different environment variables on the Vercel side, and a couple settings on the Sitecore side to enable editing on the app. So for example, if you want to use Experience Editor or Horizon, there are some additional steps to take to make that connection happen. So let's go ahead and do that next. On the Sitecore side, let's go ahead and take a look at the GSS app settings. So we left a few things blank. If we go all the way to the bottom, we left these two settings blank. And let's go ahead and configure these. These are important for getting things connected for editing experience. So if you want to see an example of what these values should be, you can actually go back to, you can go to, if we navigate to one of the Sitecore config files, this was auto-generated for the site. Again, we're not using this, but it's a good example to follow. We have an example endpoint URL and application URL below. So let's steal that. We're going to drop that in here. Now, of course, we're no longer using localhost 3000. We've deployed to Vercel, and we can go ahead and grab that and replace that as the host name for our front-end app. On the Vercel side, I actually find it kind of confusing to figure out which host name to use. Vercel creates quite a few different host names. And for example, if I was to go to a particular deployment, I can grab a URL just for that deployment, but that's not really what you want to do. You want to grab the overall project host name so that you're able to get all of the updates instead of looking directly at one deployment, which could be confusing. So if we go back to the Next.js app that we created, I can navigate to settings just to make sure I'm grabbing the right one. I can grab the domain from here, and this is the official one that I should grab. Looks good. I'm going to take that. I'm going to drop that value in here. I'm going to make sure I don't have too many slashes. And for the application URL, you just drop in the same thing without anything on the end. All right, so we're in good shape with these settings. The next step is on the Vercel side. We need to add some environment variables. So there's a few options for that. In theory, you could go to Settings, Environment Variables, and you can drop in environment variables. You can add them as needed right here. They'll show up below, and that'll work just fine. I like to add the environment variables into the .env file that's auto-created in the app. You can add them here, and Vercel will pick them up and use them as the environment variables. Doesn't matter, whichever you want to do. I just like that I can then redeploy this over and over without having to set environment variables later on in the Vercel side of things. So what we're going to set is the JSS editing secret, Sitecore API key, and Sitecore API host. If you look at the file, there's actually a few other settings, but we can leave those blank, even though it says, for example, localhost 3000, Vercel is smart enough to know its own public URL and some cool stuff like that. So let's start with the API key and the API host. We actually have those quite handy. We created those and added them as part of the JSS setup. So this file was created after the JSS setup. You can just grab a few values from there. So for the API key, here's the one that we created in Sitecore, and the host, you can just grab this, which is our Sitecore CM instance. Drop that there, and it's good like that. For the JSS editing secret, this is the probably the trickiest one. You would create the JSS editing secret when you're deploying your instance of Sitecore, and you'd be able to see if you have that on your instance by going to something like the Sitecore admin slash show config, where you can see everything set. You can see if you have the JSS editing secret set, and if it's not, you can go ahead and set it there. For the if we were to go to the demo portal, so for example, in our case, we try to expose that, make it easy for you to grab the JSS editing secret. So for this deployment, you can see we've added this copy option, a nice handy way to just grab the JSS editing secret real quick. You can steal it there and drop it into the file here. The great thing about the JSS editing secret is you really only have to set it once for the Sitecore installation. We can then add more and more headless sites on the front end, just like we did, and we can use the same editing secret. And so we can really add sites on the fly after this. All right, we look like we're in good shape. We set those 3 environment variables. Next, what we're going to do is, now that we've set the environment variables, you can make a new deployment to Vercel to deploy those environment variables to Vercel. In theory, you could just run I'm typing the wrong spot. Let's try that again. Now that I'm in the terminal, I can type Vercel. It will redeploy, just by typing that, it'll redeploy the app. But what I want to do is I want to redeploy a quote-unquote production version to take over the one that I just deployed. So I can add the -- prod. All right. Took a little over 2 minutes, but the deployment is complete. And let's go take a look and see the result. All right. On the Vercel side, the app is redeployed. It is, well, on the front end, it looks exactly the same as it did before. Nothing has changed there. But since we've deployed the new environment variables, the difference is now that we can open the application in Experience Editor or Horizon mode, and we're hooked up for editing. All right, there it is. It's loaded up. We're in Experience Editor mode. I can go ahead I can update something like the title right there. We'll save it. Perfect. And if we look back into the Sitecore side of things, on the Sitecore, let's go take a look at this, and you can see, hey, they're all hooked up. We have this hooked up to the Vercel deployment. We have editing enabled, and we're in good shape. So at this point, I mean, this is great. You've done a lot, and we can stop there. What we're going to do next, just for some extra fun, is we're going to start taking a look at Experience Edge and how you could configure that instead of just the traditional publishing. Right now, we're grabbing all of the GraphQL data from the CM, and in theory, you can switch it to publish to Experience Edge and grab all of the GraphQL queries against the Edge endpoint. So focusing now on Experience Edge, what do we need to do differently? Let's start on the Sitecore side of things. There's a few configuration changes we need to make. First off, if we were to look at publishing targets, we have our standard web publishing target. We also want the ability to publish to Edge. So let's go ahead and add a new publishing target. This is all new for Experience Edge version 20. We're going to name it Experience Edge. That's quite important. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. We're going to name that Experience Edge. Sorry, we named it Experience Edge, but the important part is here. Target database, Experience Edge. And in this case, we're going to enable the Publish to Experience Edge checkbox. Perfect. Now, why did we do that? Why was the naming important? Well, what's happening behind the scenes is the Experience Edge connector. It adds a sort of a new fake database instead of master web. This fake Experience Edge database. It's added into the config. You'd see it in the show config file, and we can now publish to that, and it will know to publish it to the Edge endpoints. All right, now that we have that configured, there's a few other changes that we need to make in our environment variables for the app. So if we're to look here, we have Sitecore API key. That's the one we created in Sitecore. If we want to connect to Experience Edge, we're actually going to swap this for the Experience Edge API key, and we're going to swap the GraphQL endpoint. So instead of looking at the Sitecore CM to grab things, we're going to be going to Experience Edge. So let's go ahead and take a look at how to do that. Now, the good news is if you're using the demo portal and with a deployment, you have Experience Edge configured and set up for you, which is, there's quite a bit of configuration involved. But once you have that set up, we have some values available. So you could actually go ahead and play with it by going to the UI through the IDE. What we're going to do, we'll come back and take a look at this in a few moments, but we're going to steal the Edge endpoint that we're using, this GraphQL v1. Make sure not to use the IDE one. That's not the one you want. You could drop that in GraphQL endpoint setting right here, and we're going to update the Sitecore API key. If we look at our Edge tenant settings here, we have the ability to copy the Edge API key. Let's go ahead and do that. We can replace this one up here. Looks good. With these changes to the environment variables, we're now pointing to Experience Edge, and we can redeploy our JSS app to Vercel. Again, we're going to do the Vercel-shaft prod, redeploy with the new environment variables, and we'll check out the app in Vercel, and we should be pointing against Experience Edge to grab the GraphQL query responses. Looks like our deployment is done. Let's go take a look at Vercel. The deployment is complete. Yep, and we have the new production version deployed to Vercel. So, okay, next, how can we tell if this is actually looking at Experience Edge or not? Well, if we take a look at the site, we can turn on publishing warnings. And I have no idea if this is on purpose or not, but it's actually quite helpful for us, is that the homepage is set to be published. It's through the workflow, but the subpages are not. So for example, the style guide, sub-content, a lot of it's not through the workflow. So let's go ahead and let's use the workbox to our advantage today, since there's lots of content to push through. Looks good. Let's select all to content mode all. And finally, we'll push everything through to published for all. Oh, it looks like we hit some validation warnings. Let's go take a look at that. Valid XT. Okay, we'll see which ones are blocked. There's only one. We'll see if we can get away without publishing that one. If we navigate back through the content editor, we could go to our site, and we can publish. Let's publish item and sub items. Let's do this. We're going to publish to Experience Edge. Publish complete. Let's navigate back to the home page. We're in good shape. And if you go to Style Guide, if I refresh a few times, we now have the JSS Style Guide page ready to go. It is now published to Experience Edge, and it's there, and we're able to look at it. Same now that we've published to Edge, we can use the IDE here, this tool. If you drop in the Edge API key, you can drop that in here into SE_API key, and you can do some sample queries against the Edge endpoint and pull stuff back. And that's a good way to make sure that everything is hooked up and actually pulling like we expect from Experience Edge. So that's pretty much it. That's the end. We just to recap, we sort of reached our goals of, we had a blank instance of Sitecore installed. It had Headless Services, SXA, and Experience Edge connector. We first created a JSS app using the JSS CLI. We were able to configure a site and app in Sitecore through the headless tenant and headless site functionality. We were able to push the app items into that newly created site and app. And from there, we were able to get things working initially with the front end running on localhost, and then on Vercel. We had a few steps to get the Experience Editor and Horizon editing experience working on the Vercel deployment. And finally, we switched from pulling our GraphQL data from the CM to Experience Edge with a few configuration changes, and we're up and running against Experience Edge. So just a little bit of fun. So there's lots of great stuff you can do even with a blank instance of Sitecore these days. So we hope you use the demo portal to start exploring lots of ideas, and we'd love to see the different types of things that you do or use the demo portal for. That's all. Thanks for watching.